It's Bullseye. I'm Jesse Thorn. My next guest is Jack Handey. He and I talked when I was recording the show in my apartment 10 years ago. A lot of people think Jack Handey is an imaginary person, but he is completely, totally real. He created Deep Thoughts. You might remember them from Saturday Night Live. The short, ridiculous bursts of fake wisdom were first published in the National Lampoon. Here's a deep thought from SNL.
And now, Deep Thoughts by Jack Handey.
One thing kids like is to be tricked. For instance, I was going to take my little nephew to Disneyland, but instead I drove him to an old burned-out warehouse. "Oh no," I said, "Disneyland burned down." He cried and cried, but I think that deep down he thought it was a pretty good joke. I started to drive over to the real Disneyland, but it was getting pretty late.
He also wrote some of my all-time favorite SNL sketches, including what I think is literally my number one, Tales of Fraud and Malfeasance in Railroad Hiring Practices. But before he started writing comedy, he was a journalist.
The jump happened actually right here in Santa Fe, in a way. I was living up on Upper Canyon Road in the upper 70s, and it was like a 150-year-old adobe house that was split in half, and I lived on one side, and Steve Martin, the comedian, lived on the other side. And this was before he was famous. He was just starting to do his nightclub act and travel around, and decided he wanted to base himself out of Santa Fe. And he'd come over and play his banjo and stuff, and got to know him a little bit. And I moved on to another journalism job in San Antonio, working for the paper down there. And one night I turned on The Tonight Show and saw Steve Martin. I would go, "Hey, my neighbor," with an arrow through his head. And next thing you know, he was the hottest thing going. And I sent him some of my humor columns and said, "Can I write for your act?" And he said, "Yeah."
What did you think of his act at the time? It was very... It was very different from the stand-up comedy that had gone before it.
Yeah, it was. It was not. I'm not crazy about satire with a capital S, so it was just totally unabashedly silly, which was it was great. I loved it. I mean, it was just absurdist.
And here is one of Canada's most famous landmarks. The world's largest umbrella mine. The mine now produces over 75,000 umbrellas per year, making over 1/10 of the world's total umbrella production.
When you were still in Texas and New Mexico, what kind of impact did the launch of Saturday Night Live have on you?
Oh, it was huge. Yeah, I remember it was a cult thing like Steve Martin, and I think I even sent some humor columns of mine to Saturday Night Live at the time, and I got their form letter back, which was something like, "You can send us some nude photos, but we don't want this stuff." So eventually, Steve Martin recommended me to Lorne Michaels.
When you started writing for Saturday Night Live, it was when Lorne Michaels had returned to the show after leaving for a while, somewhat acrimoniously. And it was kind of the first period of reinvention on the show, or the first Lorne Michaels-headed period of reinvention on the show. What was it like to be on this show that had this huge cultural cachet built in, but also had been, almost run into the ground and clearly needed to be a new thing?
There was a lot of discord on the show. The cast was sort of put together from people who were already known, like Robert Downey Jr. and Randy Quaid, and the ratings started out great, but the critics attacked us like crazy, and then the ratings gradually slid all the way down, to where I think there was some question about whether they were going to bring the show back or not.
Your writing has such a strong voice. Do you feel like you found that voice very early in your career, or was it a long process?
I think it took a process. I mean, you start out just writing what you think is funny and maybe imitative of other people, and then gradually you start realizing what you think is funny sort of fits into a character. My stuff on Saturday Night Live was usually little boy oriented stuff. Then that's sort of what I still write. I mean, about dinosaurs and cowboys and monsters and things like that. So I ended up writing things like Unfrozen Caveman Lawyer and Twinsus the Cat, and just, anything with dinosaurs and monsters and cowboys was usually mine.
We were talking on the email about my favorite Saturday Night Lives, one of my favorite Saturday Night Live sketches ever, and maybe my favorite that you wrote, although you've written a lot of great ones. Which I just had to guess was yours based on the voice, which was Tales of Fraud and Malfeasance and Railroad Hiring Practices.
Yeah, I think it was on pretty much the tail end of the show, but since you pointed that out to me, I reread it. That was a very silly piece.
I mean, I remember that, and it's like, what, that was like 1994, so that's 14 years later, and I was 12 or 13 when it aired. So
wow, you're a connoisseur. I mean,
come in.
Hi, I came about the job at the railroad. Sorry I'm late.
Well, that's okay. I just hope if we hire you, you won't be late for work. Sit down. I've been looking over your application, and everything seems in order. I just have a few questions for you.
Okay.
Okay. Have you ever driven a train?
No, sir.
Do you think you could get in a train locomotive and just by moving the switches and levers at random, make the train move down the track?
Yes, sir, I believe I could.
Mm-hmm. At a high rate of speed?
I'd certainly give it a try, sir.
Mm-hmm. And then do you think that you could stop the train, again, just by moving the levers at random?
I believe so.
Mm-hmm. Would you be willing to strike things that are on the track, like cars?
That is no problem, sir.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any gumballs or hard candy?
I have a jawbreaker.
Could I have it?
Sure.
Do you ever have one of those days when you just wake up and you think, what am I doing on this planet?
Yes, sir, many times.
And then you think, you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to go down the railroad yard and kill my boss.
Sure do. Wait, no?
No?
No.
No's good.
No.
No's good. Are you familiar with ants?
I've seen them in the movies.
Would you be willing to let ants bite you?
Yep. Yep, I think I could do that.
Mm-hmm. So how many ants would you let bite you?
As many as it takes, sir.
Ha! Well, all right, I think everything's pretty good here.
Hey, what are you doing in here?
Hey!
This has been Tales of Fraud and Malfeasance in Railroad Hiring Practices. Brought to you by Granny's Tomato Sauce. Other tomato sauces are thin and watery and should go to hell. And by Screw You Pal Tires. If you can find a better set of tires, screw you, pal.
That was the SNL sketch Tales of Fraud and Malfeasance in Railroad Hiring Practices. It was written by my guest, Jack Handey, and it's the greatest thing of all time. Deep Thoughts didn't start airing until the early 1990s, but I know that you had pitched the idea for a while, and in fact it had kind of deeper roots maybe even than Saturday Night Live. Can you tell us where they came from?
I started writing them way back. I mean, they were sort of parodies of those kind of books that came out in the 70s that were sort of diaries, and they had, sensitive diary kind of stuff. And it started out as kind of a parody of that, and then it kind of took on a character of its own. And I had them in National Lampoon and a college magazine called Ampersand that I'm not sure, but I don't think it's around anymore. And then actually Michael Nesmith, the monkey guy, put them on his show. It was another brief sketch show in prime time. There's actually a good show called Television Parts. But I couldn't get them on Saturday Night Live, and I couldn't get them published. No one wanted to publish them, and so I thought, well, the way to get things published is to get them famous and get them on TV. And so I started pushing in to get them on Saturday Night Live, but, they didn't really want a writer to have his name on things. They didn't like that, so they fought me on it for a while, and I sort of bided my time and wrote a lot of good sketches for them. And then finally they said, well, okay, we got to give him this as dessert. And of course, the irony is that people think Jack Handey is a made-up name, so it didn't work at all anyway. I still go into like a hotel or something, and people will go like, "Oh, you have the name from that as the same name as that guy on Saturday Night Live," and I'll go like, "Oh, that's me," and they go, "Isn't it funny? The same name as that guy on Saturday Night Live." They just don't believe you that you're the person.
And now, Deep Thoughts by Jack Handey.
To me, clowns aren't funny. In fact, they're kind of scary. I've wondered where this started, and I think it goes back to the time I went to the circus and a clown killed my dad.
It feels like Deep Thoughts are, in a way, the apotheosis of this character perspective that you often write from as Jack Handey. How would you? I mean, besides being interested in cowboys and Martians, how would you describe that character?
It's a character who thinks he's normal and wants the other people to empathize with him as normal, I think, but is actually sort of psychotic and dangerous, but has a logic that he thinks is quite normal. So he's not an insane person, but he's just sort of a psychotic person.
How exactly do you draw the line between the two?
Yeah, I know. Well, it can't be he can't do things that like, shooting people or something but if he says sort of mean things to kids and makes them cry, he thinks that's perfectly acceptable.
I heard you talking to my Public Radio International colleague, Faith Saley.
Oh.
And I heard you tell her something that really blew me away, which was that the deep thought, which is about telling a child, driving a child to Disneyland, but instead driving the child to a burnt out warehouse and telling him that Disneyland burned down.
Right.
Was inspired by something that actually happened to you?
Yeah, it was actually. I guess I was feeling mean, but my sister was out with her son, who was about 6 or something, and for some reason it just popped out. He was going, "I want to go to Disneyland. I want to go to Disneyland." I was going, "Oh, didn't you hear Disneyland burned down?" And he was like, he started crying. and I felt really bad. But yeah, that was based on a real incident.
What did your sister think of that?
Oh, I'm sure she was mad at me.
Is she just used to it?
Yeah, right. But he's now a grown man, and so it's probably scarred him somehow. But
And now, Deep Thoughts by Jack Handey.
When you go for a job interview, I think a good thing to ask is if they ever press charges.
I've heard that your writing process involves throwing a ball against a wall over and over indefinitely. Is that a fair characterization?
That is a total lie. No, it actually is true. Yeah, that's how I got. Well, actually, I write sketches that way too. But Deep Thoughts, throwing a ball laying on my back and throwing it against the ceiling, sort of over and over again, and then. In the case of Deep Thoughts, you write them down, and then when you've got a huge stack of them, you go through and start weeding. But yeah, that's how I do it.
I sort of imagine it as being like, I once read an article in the New Yorker about how David Milch wrote Deadwood, and it involved him being like high on back pain medication and just like this cadre of writers surrounding him, transcribing what he like his mad ramblings in iambic pentameter. That's where I imagine Deep Thoughts come from.
I wish it was that flowing, but usually it starts and stops. That would be nice if I could just get loaded and start rambling. But
just get your cats to transcribe it.
Yeah, really. Yeah, no, it's I don't know. I think somehow deep thoughts have this. There's this idea that they're easy to write because you see fake ones a lot. But for me anyway, they're hard to write, and they don't flow easily. So,
how many do you write for every one that you've published?
If I wrote, if I wrote 6 or 7 in a day, that would be a good day. And then of the ones that are published, probably 9 out of 10 I throw out. So that may be surprising when people see some of them. They may go, "Wait a minute, the other ones must be pretty horrible." But yeah, there's a big attrition rate on them.
Were there any that were your like particular faves?
I guess I've always sort of liked the one about. I like the one about if you fall off the Sears Tower, go limp, because maybe people will try to catch you because you look like a dummy.
Because hey, free dummy.
Hey, free dummy. I don't know. It twists back on itself kind of twice there, but.
Man, I've spent way too much of my life thinking about the phrase, "Hey, free dummy."
Hey, free dummy. Copyrighted by Jack Handey. Yeah, exactly.
Jack Handey from 2008. What's he up to lately? He is still writing for The New Yorker. He's still putting out books. His latest book is Please Stop the Deep Thoughts, which just came out last year. And seriously, Jack Handey, please do not stop the deep thoughts. One of the best things of all time.